kaufmännischen Bereichen wurden daraus Geschäftsmodelle und Produktentwicklung. Wir bleiben also beim Thema innovative Produkte weiterentwickeln. Bitte begrüßen Sie mit mir zusammen John van der Linden, Technology General Manager Oral Care Asia, Procter & Gamble in China. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here, John.
Thank you.
He will give his talk in English, and he will talk about customer-centric, world-class innovation in China. Das Lernfeld von morgen. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I have a long name, van der Linden. So the very first time I came to China, there was a taxi driver waiting for me with a sign saying Linden. But there was also one that said van, and there was a third guy that had a sign that said der. And it took me about 20 minutes to convince them that I really was all three of them. As you can tell, I'm originally from the Netherlands, from that name, but I've worked for Procter & Gamble now for about 22, 23 years. Part in Europe, part in the US, but I'm going to talk about the 11 years that I've spent in China and how that impacts on the things we do. I like to have fun as well, as you can tell on those pictures with family and friends, but the one with the Chinese children is one that I really am fond of because we were building a school with the community there that was quite insightful. Why have I decided that I want to work for P&G in China? Right now, there is a very clear declaration that 80% of the innovation out of a company like P&G has to come from innovation. Right? 80% of the growth comes from innovation. So you can imagine that that is very big. You can spend your way into winning a quarter, but you need fundamental better products to win in the long run. So that's where it's happening. Second one, I get to work with fantastic people. We hire a lot of people from Tsinghua University in Beijing, and I would argue that they're probably as good as MIT. I mean, really the top of the country that we have the chance to work with. And as you all are trend watchers, I'm sure you're aware that things are changing very quickly, right? We used to make products in the West and then we eventually shipped them to the East, the developing countries. That has changed in a dramatic way. If I look at my industry, for example, if you look at packaging, all the investments the industry has made over the last 10, 15, 20 years have been in the East. So these days, things are possible in the East that are no longer possible in Europe or the US. So you can simply do more. And there is an attitude of wanting to learn. When we wanted to build a new factory for Downy, call it Lenore in Europe, we went to the factory in France where we were up and running and we asked them about how quickly we could do it. And the answer was typically it would take 3 to 4 years. We went to a group of Chinese engineers who had no experience, no reasons to say no, and they challenged everything. And within 12 months from starting up, we had product coming out of the factory because there was a mindset that everything's got to be possible. And that's what I love to do. So the story that I give, I've decided rather than giving you a standard P&G story, because that would be things you can find on web pages, etc. I want to tell you my story, how I see it. Right? So I do not necessarily tell you the official P&G position along the way. I will tell you my position along the way as an innovator in this environment, how I have seen things evolve. So let's look at 3 different drivers that are going to come together. Consumer-centric innovation, what does that mean? What type of innovations are we talking about? And then we're going to talk quite a bit about Chinese culture. And then we bring it together about what it takes to make great products in China. Innovation, for me, always starts with 2 elements, right? What's needed and what's possible. What is it that consumers want, and do you have the technology ultimately to fit that? Typically, the finance people and the market research people live in the world of what's needed. Typically, my finance people and my product supply people live in the world of what's possible. And if there is an overlap, right, that's the sweet spot that we would like to be. Now, I am a big fan that everything you do has to be rooted in consumer understanding. Consumer is boss at the end of the day, right? The consumer decides every time when she goes to the shelf in the store what product to buy. So the consumer has the power. You need to figure out how you're going to satisfy that consumer so that they keep purchasing your product again and again and again. You can spend marketing on getting people to trial, but if they don't like the product, you're not going to fall for it again. So if the repurchase of the product is what I see as my scorecard as a researcher in that environment. We talked a little about Apple a minute ago. I think this is a classic industry that doesn't get it, right? I found this in Singapore the other week in a magazine, and I have no clue what it is, right? I find myself in a situation that if I need to buy a car, I can do it. If I need to buy the motorcycle, which I love to ride, I can do it. If I need to buy a new computer, I need help. I can't go to a computer store. I have to call a couple of friends and say, what is it these days that I need to look for? Well, how fast should the processor be? What is normal now in size and gigabytes? What is it? And then from my friends, I get a list of 6, 7 things that I go for. I'm at the point, actually, that I would love to change my computer because it's old. But what I hate in a new computer is that it doesn't do all the things that the old one did. Right? You get this new computer and then Sony or whoever you buy it from has this new program installed that wants to take over rather than being Microsoft. And then you can't just run your old programs, right? Even if you just download it onto your new computer, it finds out that there's all kinds of sub-programs and stuff you need to do. If there was a service that I could just bring them my old computer and say, well, just make my new computer like my old computer, exactly the same, just 10 times faster, I would pay for that, right? It's just not out there. So the second one in this space, and Apple is not free of that either, but I want to share with you, I'm wondering how we are training our kids. How many of you lie? Frequently? On paper? Right? For those of you with your hands down, right? The last time Apple asked you to install the latest software, there were 63 pages you had to read. You had to say at the bottom, I agree. None of it does this, right? And my son now is 14. He's at this age, he doesn't read anything. He signs everything. He agrees with everything. Seriously, guys, we're training a whole generation not to think about saying I agree, right? It's funny, but it's gotten in the way. So I am not surprised that a company like Apple at least took over this industry and did a lot better. Yesterday, I spent some time downstairs with Flat and Flat, who have a nice element there, a nice story, and I'm going to pick up from there. I'm going to do some storytelling. I'm going to do some storytelling of insights that I got from consumers. Most of them I don't know what to do with, or I don't know how to translate it really into better products, but I want to give you some of those about if you spend time with consumers, what you can find. The first one is an obvious one, but where do you think the largest babies in the world are? Germany? US? Sweden? China. That's the right answer. So you can imagine me having a phone conversation with the folks in Cincinnati and say, no, you think your babies are big? Let me tell you about Chinese babies. They are really big. So what's happening is that you have typically grandparents taking care of babies. And these grandparents, right, are used that the floor is dirty. So they don't let their babies crawl. If you ever had a baby, you remember how big they get. But once they start crawling, a lot of that disappears. In China, babies don't get to crawl. The moms are constantly carrying, the grandmothers are carrying them, so they don't have time to work that off. So as a result, we had to make the babies, the size of the diaper significantly larger in China, believe it or not, than anywhere else. Here's another one. At Bucks, we have our bucks and we have bed bucks, the other people's bucks. So let me give you an example of that. If my daughter is sleeping in my bed tonight and I come back tomorrow and I want to sleep in it, that's okay, it's my daughter. But if an uncle has slept in her bed, there's no way we would let our daughter sleep in that bed again, right? There is something about, right? And I saw it in extreme in Beijing as I was spending some time with a woman and I was talking about things, and she basically got her husband that came in during the interview to stop at the door, take off his clothes, and basically walk in his underwear through the living room because he was a taxi driver. So she said, look, I have no idea who we all met today. So all those bacteria are strange. We leave them at the door. We don't want them in that house. There is somewhere in that space an idea that I don't know yet, but if maybe you can make something out of it, of our bugs and other bugs, right? We're okay with our bacteria, we're not with other people's bacteria. The story about lipolase. It's always fun to have people also from competition in the room, so I want to acknowledge Henkel in this story. If you've ever been to Egypt, part of the food can be very greasy, and then you end up with lots of greasy stains. And one of the best ways of getting rid of that is an enzyme called lipolase that basically eats the lipids. Now, by the time that material came available commercially, our factory was not ready to execute. We didn't have the safety standards in place to use that material, and that would take a while. In the meantime, our competitors were going out there with advertising of lipolase, 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 and lipolase, and there was nothing I could do for almost a year. But as we were spending time with the consumers, we figured out that most consumers didn't really get what lipolase was. So we asked them, well, what do you do when you have something very greasy? It turns out they still go back to good old soap and use soap on top of the detergent. So what we then finally introduced was Ariel with super soap. We didn't talk about lipolase. And that worked tremendously well because that was the consumer insight, right? It was the same technology, but we talked about it significantly differently, and that drove part of the market size. Some of you might remember that probably about 15 years now, Turkey went through this phase of hyperinflation. Remember that? It had an incredible high inflation, and as you talk to the consumers and say, okay, in this environment where the economic situation is very hard, what do you want? And the typical answer was smaller sizes, lower prices. And one of our competitors was actually on air with a TV copy with two young boys playing basketball, and one of them gets a ball against his shirt, and it's all muddy, and it's dirty, and it doesn't look very good. And the other guy says, well, your mom's going to be upset. And he said, no, it's okay, because he has just enough money to buy a 200-gram sachet of laundry detergent. So small, because that is what basically the consumers told that they wanted, something low. The interesting thing was, when you spent time with the consumers and you went with her on a shopping trip, she did something completely different. She knew that what she had in her pocket now, what she would buy now, would be more expensive a week later or probably 2 weeks later. So the opposite thing started happening. When they had their salary of their husband, they would run to the store and basically buy everything they needed for the month ahead, as much as possible. So while a competitor went to 200 grams, we went to 20 kilogram bags of detergent. And we found families buying them and sometimes sharing them, because that was the insight, that you wanted to spend the money as quick as you could because the inflation was going on. I have one about men in China, which is that one of my assignments was on Gillette, and I was spending time with consumers, and I figured out very quickly that Chinese men don't have a lot of hair to remove. It tends to be just around here. And it's kind of hard to then say, well, you need 5 blades, right? It's kind of... So I started a new trend to see whether we could drive off consumption, but that's not really catching on so far. But what we did find is that you could look at the market very differently. You could look at how much money are people spending on shaving, and you could say, well, we have an 80% share, we do good. You could turn it around and say, how much money are these guys spending between waking up and leaving the house? What are the products that they're using? And to our surprise, we found that almost all Chinese men are using moisturizers and UV cream. UV cream is important because most of these guys don't want to look like they're working on the field. They want to show off that they have an office job, right? So trying to stay white is a huge, huge need that is out there. So rather than trying to push Gillette very hard, I got into Olay for Men, and we launched Olay for Men as a product out there because that was a clear opportunity we had. And Chinese or Asian men in general are much more willing to admit that they need moisturizers and take care of themselves. I guess here in Europe is a little better than the US, right? We're not yet too worried about being too gay if you apply a moisturizer on your face, but it's getting there. Innovation types. Yesterday, the presentation from Adobe had a definition. I like to share a slightly different definition in that process. I like to think of them as, first of all, commercial innovation. Commercial innovation, I would not touch and change my product at all. The second one is incremental or sustainable innovation. And the third one is disruptive. So let me give you some examples. Take a product like Pampers. Obviously, Pampers keeps baby dry. But you can only repeat that so many times, right, before it gets very boring. So one of the things we did, we took 500 families, 250 of them we keep Pampers, and the other 250 stayed with cloth diapers, the original, right, cotton diapers that was still out there in China. And what you find from the picture, from the video footage, is that the babies that are dry sleep significantly better and longer than the babies who wake up because they're wet. Now you can work with the Ministry of Health and you work on relations that basically better, longer sleeping is good for your baby. So now I can say you that using Pampers is better for the baby's development. That's a commercial innovation. I haven't touched my product. In fact, in the same videos, we also saw that moms showed up significantly more in the babies that were still using cotton rather than Pampers. So you say, hey, moms, if you want to sleep, right, use Pampers. So it's a different way of selling the same product over and over again. The incremental or sustainable is probably more easy, right? You know that next time that Ariel is going to be improved or that Persil is going to be improved, right? It's a constant and more predictable way of doing it. And then lastly is the disruptive part, and that's obviously the most challenging part. But an example here is white strips, right? Where if you want to get your teeth white, you can go to a dentist and it will cost you a couple of $100. We have a product where you basically, it's like a strip, you glue it onto your teeth, you take it off after half an hour, you do 4 or 5 of those, and it significantly has bleached your teeth, taken off all the stains on the outside, and you end up with significantly whiter teeth. So disruptive can really change rules of how things are going. Now what I'm going to propose is that China is the place where they are best at doing things disruptive. Then they do commercial innovation, and the predictable incremental is much more difficult. I find that if I work in Europe, we're much more comfortable with playing chess, right? We kind of know if I do this, then he does that, and that tends to be much more the predictable level of innovation. What the Chinese have seen for themselves over the last years is that every time things change at a rate that they have never seen before. So 20 years ago, they were dreaming that maybe one day they could own a car, right? Now they're into buying their second car or their third car. Maybe I could ever own my house. Now they're thinking about investing into stock markets. So all the rules and assumptions that they made get changed so quickly that they're used to it much more in terms of disruptive thinking than we tend to be. So let me talk to you a little bit more about Chinese culture, and sometimes I give this talk in China too, and then turn it around, and then I explain how strange Westerners are. So now I'll try to do a little bit more about how Chinese are. But first of all this, right? We need to realize that we're in a very, very strange situation, right? 10% of the world population owning 60% of the world economy. That's just not going to stay that way, right? It is not a rise of China or a rise of the East. I think we go back to a way that it has always been, where an economy is much more in function of the size of the people rather than, you know, a small group of people owning the world. We tend to know very little about China and what's out there, but they know a lot about us, right? They know Madonna, they know the latest World Cup, they know the countries, they know significantly more about Christmas than we know about Spring Festival or Chinese New Year. And then as a Dutchman, I always like to remind myself that, you know, I've lived in Amsterdam and I've lived in Brussels. That would be villages, right, compared with what's out there in China. With 700 cities that probably most of us have never heard of us. More than 1 million people along the way, right? So there is this whole market out there that is tremendous in the process. So first time I arrived, this is kind of how I felt. Everything that my parents had taught me was no longer valid, right? I wanted to queue up in the line, and that was not the right system because people pushed and shoved and got things done. And it took me a while to realize that there is advantage. If you have long arms, you can get things faster resolved. So hey, I like that. It was after that I moved to the US for a while. I had to unlearn a lot of those skills, but you know, it does work. So as part of this strange thing of the last 200 years, there is a lot of assumption. Whenever I'm back in Europe and I read the press or I see the news, it's incredible how negative it always is on China. because we tend to look at China very much from a Western paradigm. And the assumption is that if people just get more money and more time, that ultimately they will move to the same system that we have. And I am pretty convinced that that's not going to happen. I'm pretty convinced that they fundamentally have different needs in the process. So in China, being this integration of state, being the private people, right, and companies as one, it's a very coherent story. They get very confused if a European government says one thing, but a European company then says another thing, right? Because we have conflicting demands or desires of where we come out. In China, it's very, very integrated. And it's very difficult to say where does the government stop and where does private business start. If you look at the stocks on Wall Street, even companies like Haier, right, have a significant chunk of up to 30 to 40% being ownership of the state. They sit on the Politburo, right? So it's very difficult to say, well, this is where the state stops or this is where it starts. Some of my toothpaste competitors are 30, 40% owned by the state. So if they make a claim and I think it's invalid, well, how do you go to court? How do you do that, right? It becomes very difficult in that process. So there's a fundamental different system. Now, I'm not going to defend China. I'm just saying that what I've observed are 4 major drivers of what I think China is developing so incredibly quickly. First of all is the one-child policy, a sharp contrast with a country like Bangladesh. If you have 7 to 12 children on average, if you just think about how quickly you have to grow the economy to make sure that things stay flat, that in itself is very, very hard. If all of a sudden you say, whoop, right, 1 child, so every 2 parents, 1 child, even if the economy kind of would stay the same, you already doubled the average income. So there's a tremendous effect that takes place the moment you decide to go for 1 child. The second one is there's an incredible level of investment that is going into education and into infrastructure. A sharp contrast for me, for example, with India, where in China I find myself sometimes finding a completely new road going nowhere and wondering why the hell that is. But you come back a year later and there's a whole industrial park and they have planned it all out and that's what they execute. Well, in India, if I go to certain cities, the same situation and deadlock in traffic is still there as it was 20 years ago because they're still arguing about should we get a new road or not, right? This modern state capitalism, as I call it, is not state companies the way that they used to be, not state companies that are incredibly inefficient. They bring in the best knowledge that they can get from all over the world. And they don't stay in China, right? They're the oil companies that are out there now in Africa. They're the banking companies that are out there. So they honestly run them as very effective companies. And last but not least, there's the effect of women. If you compare it, for example, with a country like Japan, where women virtually don't play a role at all, women are not held back in China. I have not lost one person in my group because of pregnancy and wanting to raise children. That's what grandparents are for. I've had the opposite. I had people in my office complaining that their grandparents don't want to raise their kids. That was just socially, that's the assumption. It's the task of the grandparents to take care of that. There's no religion like the Middle East that keeps these women and saying you have to stay home, and there's no social, expectation, right? Yes, you have a structure now of 2 parents. They need to take care of the child financially and the 4 grandparents, right? And that's what their job is. Their job is to generate income for that family structure, not to raise the kid. I mean, that taking to school and from, that's what grandparents can do. So how does that culture evolve? If I remember my very first time in China, in Guangzhou, I was talking to this woman and trying to figure out on products. But as I was talking to her, I realized that on the right side, you could hear literally what the neighbors were saying. And while I was talking to her, I could see across what they were watching on TV in that house. You could see what that woman was cooking across, right? And on the other side, there was a radio playing, and you could hear that radio playing. The only way for that woman to survive is to basically block out everything and not give a about anything, living her life. Now you take that woman, you put her in a car, and she needs to turn left. She turns left. If it's a 6-lane street and everybody has to stop, she turns left, right? So this is the thing that happens with us as Westerners, right? When we keep the door open for somebody else, that concept just doesn't exist. They don't see you. Now, if you're a friend, I mean, there's incredible, warm and kind people. But in the whole process, right, if you haven't been one of them that stands out, they basically need to go about life to get through things. Any idea of these friendly people, sleeping away nicely? That would be probably a normal situation, I guess, in your living room as well. But this happens to be IKEA. And this is no exception. I mean, there's people everywhere sleeping. And that's that same concept, right? They walk into the IKEA store, see a nice couch, and go for a nap. I mean, they basically block out everybody else, because that's what they've always have to do for all those years as things go by. There's a website, actually. If you want to, if you like the picture, there's a website about it, so you can find it. Another key driver is personality. We tend to have a much more deviated person. I can have a hard argument with a colleague at work. That person can call me stupid 3 times in a meeting, and afterwards we go for a beer. That's okay, right? That wouldn't work in the Chinese culture because it's much more holistic. They don't have a separation out of it. So they either let you into that person, to you, or not. So they don't have this segment of this is my private life, this is my business life, it tends to be one and the same in the whole process. And that makes it also very hard sometimes to keep up the appearance like we have in the West, as if relationships don't matter, right? We tend to have this appearance that companies in between, this is the rules and this is how we play, and it doesn't matter if I'm a friend of yours or not. That's very different in that whole cultural context. You see that a lot in terms of how you go about things, right? We as Westerners, typically when we work together, we want to get results. That is the most important thing. And then maybe a relation might come out of it, maybe not. That's okay, as long as we get the work done. That tends to be very different in China, right? It starts with relationship. And there, out of that comes a lot of trust. And a lot of it important is wining and dining. So having good food and taking time for that, not rushing their spirit. Because that's a moment where you really connect. And I've seen a lot of Western companies come in wanting to negotiate a contract. Well, the Chinese just want to get to know. So who are you? I mean, do you have children? Well, what's up? Right? So it is so important that you start with the relationship rather than start with a contract. That is a very, very different process all along. Now, in generally, the Chinese are much more looking at what is the right thing for the group, something that they call harmony. So if for the city it's the right thing to build a new metro station and therefore these 200 families have to move, then in average those 200 families are very happy to move because it's for a good cause. We tend to start from the individual, right? We start from us. And therefore, if one farmer refuses to sell a piece of land, then a certain road just can't get built for a few years, right? I mean, we start from thinking individual. They start much more from what is the right thing for the community to look at. And then there's this whole thing of top-down. It's a very, very top-down society, whether that's the news or whether that is in the job. I find it amazing that if you look at, for example, the Chinese evening news, whatever is being said, if you talk the next day to colleagues, they take it 100% as truth, right? That's how the information comes, top down. This whole concept of the internet is scary because all of a sudden everybody can talk to everybody and there's other concepts that are flying around. It is a bit more like the boss says jump and you say how high, right? How high do you want me to jump? Not necessarily everybody thinking for themselves, right? Working with their team and their bosses on changing things. So it is still a very much a top-down type of society. And then there is the information flow. The Chinese are, on average, very eager to learn and listen. And before anybody in China would call themselves an expert, that would take many years, because the experts are kind of like put on a pedestal, right? We Westerners tend to think that once we know a little bit, we are, pretty good and we can talk about it, including myself here today, right? So, here you go through the process of how, in general, the East is sucking information, right? And the West is giving out. And as I run a global technical center, we're finding it's pretty hard to get Chinese colleagues to actively share information with the rest of the world. Because that's never been their job, right? They've always been fed information top down or sideways, but not necessarily getting it out. With all the changes going on, I must admit I'm sometimes a little reluctant on yet a new technology, right? Or yet a new software, or yet a new system. I tend to be a little, I find my colleagues in China are the other way around. They love that. But whenever I get a new boss or systems change, I like that, because it's a new relationship, it's a new chance, and my ex-boss will go somewhere else, and therefore I now have another line into another business or what have you. But for the Chinese, that is very hard, because that relationship is so important. If you take people out and you replace a boss by rotating, that's when people are at risk, for example, for leaving the company the most, because they really invest in that relationship. So boss is king in that process. So in the innovation process, and I know that you have talked about how the West has to change this, but we tend to make 10-year plans, right? And then from a 10-year plan, we make maybe a 5-year plan, and then we plot out what we need to do. And we spend an incredible amount planning, and then we almost expect that everything will go perfect. The Chinese tend to do things much differently. They tend to say, I have no clue what the world looks like next year, right? 5 years from now, don't even ask me. So let me try something. How about this? How about that? So it's much more trial and error. And I find a lot of innovation reviews, that is really difficult for Western managers. Because you have an innovative Chinese guy talking about how they're trying new things, and we as Westerners trying to slow them down and say, well, tell me, where do you want to go? Where do you think it's going to lead to? How is this sustainable? And do you see a blank stare on their face? Like, well, no, I don't know. I'm just trying, right? It's fundamentally different the way that we innovate. So, innovation culture in China, you need to be very clear on how you talk. When I first came there, I made quite a few mistakes of talking things like, why don't we try this? Or why don't we try that? And a lot of those why don't we typically came up with pretty stupid ideas that I just necessarily had done much thinking of. But I found the organization then immediately moving to execution. The boss wants me to do X, the boss wants me to do Y. And I say, no, I'm doing a thought experiment, right? Just slow down. So be very clear on, are you talking about possibilities or action? Because if you confuse these things, you drive an organization very quickly. It's got to be holistic, right? You have to be very consistent how you talk. And there's a lot of trust and encouragement involved. You need to really, really connect with the people. One-on-one meetings are the best, because it's very difficult for them to say in a public meeting, you know what, I don't think your idea is all that good, because they're afraid about the effect that might have on you in front of all their colleagues. So you need to do a lot of one-on-one conversations. And then, I mean, if I could buy a stock at the US exchange that was about Chinese women, I would buy that, because I think they're going to rule the world. They're so savvy with money. They're not held down by anything. I really think that women will take up in China even more than in the West. So, how do we work better together? I think that the Chinese have to learn to become more assertive, more accountable, and to make sure that everybody starts to think. And I think that I, as a Westerner, also need to learn a lot. I need to learn to be less aggressive. I need to be much more about the long-term relationship with people, but really relationship. And I need to be much more open to technology and the changes that it constantly provides. And learning to fail, right? In their innovation process, it's much more acceptable to fail. And we need to be more open to different cultures. We need to be able to learn in how other people work it. So if I summarize my talk, what consumers tell you is not always what they do, so be very careful with that. If you want to win in China, you've got to embrace this disruptiveness, because that's what they have very, very strongly in them, and then stick to it. Time, consistency, and drive the same thing over and over again. We're going to take some questions, I guess, but in case it doesn't get through, drop me an email on this account, and I'll try to answer any questions that you might have in the process. All right? Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much. I think John has explained us a whole new market which